the booktube. It's Rose, and it's a week into September as I speak, and time to do a bit of a wrap up of the things that I read in August. Now, I finished 14 books in August, which is quite a lot. So I'm going to try and do this relatively briskly, so it's not ridiculously long. But I do love to let you know what I've read and hear if you read any of them or you fancy reading some of them, and do I recommend them, and which ones were perhaps just a little bit disappointing or didn't work for me. So, and what a very month it was. I read ancient poetry, modernist poetry, brand new fiction, lots of things in translation, classics, the whole selection. So there should be something here for everybody, I hope. I read 2 new 2025 published novels by British authors. And one of those got an individual review video earlier in the month, and one didn't. And should you read something into that? Yes, you probably should. So the one that did was Ripeness by Sarah Moss, which was a really rich, satisfying book with a dual timeline, which is something I enjoy if it's done well. But this was the same person at 2 different points in her life. It was really atmospheric and kind of emotionally complex, I suppose. Strong recommendation from me, and I'll give a link to the video that I made sort of talking about it in more detail. The other one was Gunk by Saba Sams, and this is a debut novel. I read it because I read it with my book group, and we read it because it's set in Brighton, where we live, and the author, Sams, grew up in Brighton, although she now lives in London. So, it had a strong local connection. Also, she published a very successful collection of short stories about 3 years ago, I think 2022. And I think it was one of those sort of Granta, best of the young British writers sort of series, so lots of praise. I have to say that the novel was not a bad novel, but it didn't live up to the expectations that those would have set, I suppose. I really enjoyed the kind of sticky, grubby, grotty Brighton nightclub that was kind of a key setting for the book. That was, satisfying. And the kind of bartenders and security guards and sort of all those characters and their sort of dialogue and how they were brought out, that was good. But given that it's a book about a kind of relationship triangle and a sort of supposed desperate yearning for parenthood, for motherhood, I found it a bit flat, a little shallow, I suppose. But, she's a young writer. There were some things in it that really suddenly I saw a flash of why her short stories might have been so highly thought of. Some moments about pregnancy, some moments of description of birth, that were I was right there. So we'll see where she goes. But I wouldn't particularly recommend it to read, I guess, unless you're particularly interested in books set in and around nightclubs. There you go. In contrast, the next 2 books that I read were both linked to reading the Globe fiction, were both really rich and interesting books. Okay, so first I'm going to talk about is Old Kiln by Jia Pingwa. Now, that was published in English, the English translation in 2020. That was translation by James Trapp, Olivia Milburn, and Christopher Payne. The original, it was published in China in 2011. So it's recent, but not sort of brand new in China. Now, Jia Pingwa is very popular and very well thought of writer in China. He's in his 70s now. He's been writing for years. Some long history of novels, short stories, poetry. But not very well known in this country as yet. Is this the book that will make him well known? I think not, and not because it isn't a really brilliant book, but because it's very, very long, and I think that's quite sort of off-putting perhaps to a lot of writers, readers, to embark on an unfamiliar author and a book that certainly, like in my ebook edition, said it was 1,550 pages. I think the paper copy said it was 960. I'm not quite sure, but it's a huge book. I have to say it's also a huge book in the other sense of the word, in that it's extraordinary, it's fascinating, it's just I lived the book, and although I found it sort of in some ways a bit overwhelming, it was also overwhelmingly interesting. Jia Pingwa is he was born in 1952, so sort of not that long after the communist sort of revolution in China. And he was born in Shaanxi, in a rural village. So that's in the sort of north, and so that's Shaanxi is a province in the northwest of China. And his writing kind of draws very much on the region that he comes from and the rural life there. And, it could be described as realist, I suppose. But in this novel, I would say it's kind of realist with slightly more unusual kind of layers that perhaps draw on sort of traditional storytelling in some way. The main character, Inkcap, who's a marginalized teenager, he can hear and understand animals, and that kind of pops up from time to time, whereas the majority of the book is about the sort of very, intimate, gritty detail of the day-to-day life of these villagers. But we follow their lives for a year in such detail. I mean, you practically feel like, somebody sneezed in one corner of the village, you can hear about it in the story. But that matters because this is 1966. It's the beginning of the Cultural Revolution. And, if you know any Chinese history, you will know what sort of chaos that came from that, the Cultural Revolution. In this village, way, way, way from the centre of things, way from the capital, a real backwater. The Cultural Revolution does hit, though, and it hits in ways that bring out all the sort of hidden tensions, rivalries, things that perhaps have been going on in the village going back generations and are now kind of come to the fore through this, sort of opportunity, in a way. Opportunity is a strange word to use, when it ends up with the most horrendous sort of violence and internecine sort of conflict within the village. It's interesting that he feels able to write that now. There's not a lot of fiction written about the Cultural Revolution in China. There's not a lot of anything other than fiction written about the Cultural Revolution in China. It was a difficult time that in many ways people just sort of put to one side and don't question each other's behaviour at the time. And now obviously it's sort of slipping into history. Jia Pingwa was a teenager when it happened. He lived through it, and his father and his family were intimately and negatively affected by it. So I got a lot out of it as a book. I read it because it was our August choice for Reading the Globe fiction, the sort of contemporary strand. And Katja of Page Turns with Katja and I are doing a live show. We'll be recording that this evening. So it may, depending on when you watch this or how quickly I manage to upload it, it's probably already happened. But you could watch the recording if you're interested, because on that live show, we expect to have Daniel and David from Sinoist Books, the publishers in Britain of the book, and we'll be talking to them. So not just about the detail of this book, but more about how they came to choose it, get it translated, publish it, the sort of why they feel it was important and worthwhile to do that. So it should be an interesting discussion. And once it's happened, I will link it in the notes below, because it's going to be on Katja's channel. So, extraordinary, memorable, and a challenging read, but not, something I'm glad to have read, put it that way. The other thing that I read for Reading the Globe this month was God's Bits of Wood by Sembene Ousmane, Senegalese author, and translated by Frances Price. Now that was for the Reading the Globe Classics strand, and it's a modern classic from Senegal. It was written in 1960 and actually translated in 1962. So, translated, very much at the time. Here it is, in fact. There we go. And it's about a strike on the Dakar-Niger Railway, a real strike that took place, but it's a fictionalised account, in 1947, 1948. And it's a realist novel. It's episodic. The episodes are kind of linked to the different towns along the railway and the strikers in those different towns and sort of individuals. And although it's episodic and tells the story through sort of those sort of episodes, those different characters, they interconnect, they come together. Different characters recur through the book. It's for a sort of 1960 Senegalese novel written about groundbreaking railway worker strike. It's incredibly engaging. I really enjoyed it, and so did the other people in the Reading the Globe Discord group that read it too. A real positive, and one I wouldn't have read if it weren't for our Reading the Globe sort of. I'd heard of it, but I probably would never have got around to it, and thank heaven I did. There you go. So that was two things by men in translation. But August, of course, is Women in Translation Month. So, where's the books by women in translation that you read, Rosa? Well, I will tell you about a few of those. So I actually read 5 books by women in translation. I think I did justice to Women in Translation this month. And I've done individual videos for 2 of those, so I won't say too much of them about them, except that, they're both winners in my eyes. So one of those was on the calculation of volume, which is by Solvej Balle. It was translated by Barbara Haveland. I read it with Tilly. It came out recently. It was longlisted for the International Booker. That's right, yeah, the International Booker. It's basically, in our discussion about the book, we both just go on about how much we loved it and why it's such a great book. Interestingly, I think I went into it not necessarily expecting to absolutely love it, and I did, because it's a time loop book, and I was a little suspicious about that. It's also, in theory, the first book of a septology, and I was a little suspicious about that. But actually, it's just spot on. I was really engaged. It is repetitive because, a story about someone reliving the same day 365 times, in effect, well, it has to be repetitive, but it wasn't repetitive. It was repetitive in an appropriate way and not in a way that was boring. It's beautifully written and full of the most interesting ideas, and I'm really looking forward to volume 2, which I plan to read in November. So, maybe I'll read all 7. Who knows? I'm not a great reader of series, but I'm very intrigued by this one, and yeah, she's a good writer, and it's the first thing she's written for or managed to get published for years, even though she was a successful writer like 20 years ago in Denmark. There you go. Now, the other one that I made an individual video about is less recent. It's a Bulgarian modern classic, The Case of Jem by Vera Multachieva. And what a stupendous book this was that I had no idea I was going to love. And I just adored it. It was a real Ros book. If you want to understand why, you probably better watch that individual video. But, it's a book about a 15th century Turkish prince, son of the Sultan, the Ottoman emperor, who his father dies, and he and his brother are vying for the throne, and he ends up in Western Europe as a sort of a pawn of various sort of Western European powers, France and the Knights of St. John and the papacy, and it's a it tells his tale without, you never hear directly from him. You hear from all these kind of witnesses. I can't do it justice in this brief summary, but do watch the video, and I do say, read this book. It's a Bulgarian modern classic you didn't know you needed to read. I wish I could be equally enthusiastic about this one, which is Reckless by Cornelia Funke. So it's another of my women in translation choices. I loved some of her children and sort of young adult books that she's written previously. This is from 2010, but a sort of updated version for 2016, I think. The translation is by Olivia Latsch. I read it because of Reading the Globe again, because it's the YA middle grade sort of book choice for August, but it was just sort of okay. It's fantasy, YA or middle grade or something. It's sort of like teen, I suppose, but not YA, maybe. Fantasy, and it was okay. I'll leave it at that. I wanted it to be wonderful, and it wasn't. That's what it is. What about this one? Now, goodness me, there's a little clue here in the number of little sticky notes in it that I haven't yet pulled out, because I hardly know how to describe this book to you. It's The Tyranny of Flies. It's by Elaine, Vilar, Madruga. She's an author from Cuba. The translation is by Kevin Gerry Dunn. It was published in Spanish in 2021. The translation was published in 2024, so it's new. It's set on a Caribbean island that is sort of Cuba, but not exactly, but very much dealing with sort of as a dictatorship. And it almost doesn't matter what kind of dictatorship it is. It doesn't matter that it happens to be a communist one, not a right-wing one. It's about tyranny, as it says, tyranny in the state, tyranny in the family. It's the story of Dad, who's the right-hand man of the dictator, Pop Moustache, and his odd, rather withdrawn, therapy-obsessed wife, and his 3 very unusual children, from teenage Cassandra down to toddler Kalia, who doesn't speak, is situationally mute, I suppose you'd say now in English. I'm almost lost for words talking about this book. It's one of those books that you read and you think, well, this starts odd, what am I reading? And then it just keeps getting odder. And you end up thinking, really, what am I reading? And why am I kind of almost equally engaged and engrossed and horrified by this book, in equal measure. In fact, it's violent, at times it's disgusting. There's a kind of menace throughout that is really powerful. It has a very satisfying ending. I can hardly describe. I think you have to read it to understand it. It's not for the faint-hearted. I say that sometimes about books, and I genuinely mean this is not for the faint-hearted. But if you have a taste for the unusual and weird and sort of horrid and yet full of ideas and really well written and well translated, then this could be a book for you. I read it with the lovely Ian. Thank you, Ian, for helping me enjoy it. Now, from the subversive and unusual to the totally predictable. Okay, this. So, as well as being Women in Translation Month, August is Garbaugust. We are exhorted to read something a bit junky in August, and I tried. I did. I read Richard Osman, We Solve Murders. Is it junk? Is it garbage? Perhaps that's a little of it. But it kind of is, or it's as sort of garbagey as I'm able to stomach, I suppose. Osman is very clever and he knows what he's doing. And this is the first book of a new, I was going to say franchise, series, a new series. So he wrote The Thirsty Murder Club, and this one is going to be the sort of the We Solve Murders series. And is it entertaining? Yes. Is it highly readable? Yes. Is it utterly forgettable? Yes. I think that's the thing to say. But it wasn't unpleasant to read. It was fun. There you go. Now, yeah, I'd say it was disposable. That's the word. The absolute opposite in that sense of this. Okay, if you're going to talk about a writer who's the opposite of disposable, it has to be Sappho, doesn't it? Because, and this is Sappho Stung with Love, Poems and Fragments, and it's a collection of her work that's edited and translated by Aaron Poochigian. You know Sappho, you must do. If not, just in case, I'll just cover the bases. So was recognised by the ancient Greeks as their finest poet. She was born sometime after 630 BCE. We don't know the exact date. She died around 570 BCE. She lived all her life, as far as we know, on the island of Lesbos, which is sort of near the coast of Turkey, but was within the sort of the Greek world, the Greek-speaking civilization of the time. She wrote, as I say, poetry that was universally recognised by her sort of subsequent generations for its sort of brilliance and beauty. But unfortunately, very, very little of what she wrote survived. And until recently, or until sort of somewhere in the 19th century, all we had of her was bits of her writing that other authors quoted, other Greek authors and Latin authors, that little snippets, they'd say, I copied this from Sappho, or Sappho did this, or, and then you get a few lines. Then when we started sort of doing sort of archaeology in sort of Egypt and various places, we started to find more, amazingly, like fragments of papyrus with bits of Sappho's verse written on them. Many of them actually like scrunched up and stuffed inside coffins, or the sort of bulk out mummified bodies, and that's why we've got more little bits of her poetry, and how wonderful that is. And even in the last sort of 10 years they found more, so we will gradually, we hope, get more bits and pieces of Sappho. Very lovely poems, a really good introduction and notes. Wasn't quite so sure about some of I keep getting his name wrong. Poochigian, I can't keep it in my head, but some of Poochigian's translation choices, I wasn't so sure. Some of his vocabulary, he was trying to make it sort of very modern and relevant, and sometimes it slightly jarred. But well worth a read, and not at all, not a struggle. She's very immediate and fresh, and he writes about love and people, and yeah, there you go. Don't need me to sell Sappho, the greatest woman poet of classical times. There you go. It was a good month for poetry for me, because the other poetry that I read was not ancient, modern, or more specifically modernist, because in August I was reading poems by Thomas Sterne Eliot, T.S. Eliot. A group of us agreed to read some of Eliot's sort of most significant and sort of well-known poems across the course of the month. But I actually read all of this edition, the collected poems 1909 to 1962. Eliot's poetry is difficult, is challenging. Let's not pretend otherwise. But it's also, and he's not always likeable, and the poems are not always likeable. But I do believe that he has written some of the finest poems in the English language, and certainly of the 20th century. Ash Wednesday and the Four Quartets are some of the poems that mean most to me, I suppose, of anything that I've read. So I was very pleased to revisit them in the company of a wonderful group of people. And at the end of the month, we sort of lightened things up a bit by reading more of his poems, but the ones that he wrote for his godchildren about cats. Old Possum's Book of Practical Cats by T.S. Eliot. It's a book. Well, the poems in here I had read to me as a child. I learnt some of them by heart. I've recited them. They're an absolute joy. They're a scream, actually. And if you want to say you've read T.S. Eliot, but you don't want to read The Wasteland, read Old Possum. But it's great. Read it to your children if you have any. There you go. Read McCavity to them. Now, Eliot was an American, but he came to England, settled, and considered himself ultimately an English poet. And certainly his later poems, things like the Four Quartets, are very English in their feel. Another American modernist writer, but one who's almost like epitomizes the American early 20th century novel is William Faulkner. And every August I read a William Faulkner novel or collection of short stories in company with a group of other readers for Faulkner in August, and I'm sort of like a co-host of that, but it's quite an informal bit of sort of co-hosting. And this year we read Go Down Moses, and I'm very glad we did. Now, Go Down Moses is you can either see it as 7 short stories or you can see it as a novel. The short stories are interlinked. There's characters that recur through all of them. But at first I thought, these are just short stories and they're just sort of loosely linked together. By the end of the novel, I definitely thought this is a novel. There is a sort of a theme, a set of ideas, a sort of a coherence to it that only becomes apparent when you really get towards the end of the book. It's Faulkner at his most, kind of like humane and compassionate and sympathetic in many ways. He's saying something about sort of interconnectedness, I suppose, but also about the sort of culpability of the American South, but not just in relation to each other, and in particular around slavery and sort of what followed sort of from that since, but also about their sort of responsibility towards the land and complicated, interesting. I'm really glad to have read it with the Faulkner in August group. Wouldn't be like the first Faulkner. You could read it as your first Faulkner, but the thing that Faulkner does is he just drops you into his stories, and he doesn't cut you any slack. You could say the same about Eliot in his poetry, but Faulkner just sort of, it's like he's just saying, keep up. Don't expect me to stop and explain things. Just keep up, and that's where having a group to read with is very helpful. There you go. The last thing that I'm going to say that I read, the 14th book that I haven't yet spoken about this month, was more of a classic. It's a 19th century English book. It was A Pair of Blue Eyes by Thomas Hardy. I read it in August because I'm part of a group that's reading through all of Thomas Hardy's novels in publication order, and this was his 3rd published novel. I'm not going to necessarily reread the ones that I've already read and know well, but this, A Pair of Blue Eyes, is one that I've never read. Now, it's not one of his best known novels, and probably for a reason. It's a slightly lesser work. It's not far from The Madding Cloud. That's the Crowd. That's the one we're reading, or is being read in September. It's not The Merricaster Bridge. It's certainly not Tess of the D'Urbervilles. It's more autobiographical than some of his novels. So for someone who loves Thomas Hardy, loves Hardy's Wessex, is interested in Hardy's writing, it's a satisfying thing to read and get another sort of a sense of him emerging as the novelist that he would become. Thank you, Jen the librarian, for prompting me to read it. So that was my August reading. Obviously, I would love to hear your comments on that, but I will stop now because this is quite long enough.